London was a big and crowded city in 1666. The houses in the city were very close to each other and they were made of wood mostly. At that time, the same with almost all of the world, people were using fire for any of their needs like lighting in the nights, cooking or making hot water. Because of this fact, a fire could get out of control very easily because it was everywhere to use. At the same time, firemen and fire engines were lacking in service because of the lack of sources and men due to past wars and illnesses that killed most of the people. The date was 2nd of September 1666. It was an early Sunday. King's baker, Thomas Fariner, went to bed, but he did not put out the fire from his heated oven. Sparks from the oven started to cover the walls very fast because of the dry floor sacks, and in the blink of an eye, fire was on the streets. Soon, smoke covered London. The sky became red. By Monday, 300 houses had already burned down. The fire was immediately carried by wild winds. The flames twisted in the streets. After 4 days, when the fire finally died out, 3/4 of the city was burned to the ground. Churches, shops, and any kind of 13,000 building had been burned to dust. Over 100,000 people were left homeless, despite the fact that they tried to help to stop fire. After a while, people stopped trying to stop the fire and instead they started running. Pudding Street was like a human flood. Because of the drought spell after 1665 in London, the conditions for fire was perfect. There was no moisture to slow the fire. The fire was not only fed by the wooden structures, but also by coal, oil, pitch, wax, gunpowder, alcohol, turpentine, and bales of straw found in the warehouses along the near of the Thames River. Thus, this fire affected the future of the world just like the fire of Rome. Even though Charles II tried to rebuild the city after the fire, the sources and manpower was not enough to build a whole city in such a short time. It seemed like a very good opportunity to rebuild the city after the disaster and modernize the country. But as mentioned, because of the lack of firemen, people were exhausted, also the sources were destroyed too. The sad experience of this fire showed the bad side of wooden houses and the benefits of bricks, also the very need of strong fire departments everywhere. The other most important results of the Great Fire of London are: firstly, the urban perspective was highly affected. Secondly, the immigrant situation changed very visibly.
All the conflict and dilemmas regarding the reason for the fire started to lead rumors about immigrants at some point. The French and Dutch in England were thought to be the cause of the inexplainable fire, because the Allies formed in a war that was unrelated to the fire. This has probably seemed to the English as if they were, as a team, invading the city. Also, it may be seen as the revenge of the Dutch for the fact that, weeks ago, there was a war between the English and Dutch which was called the Anglo-Dutch Wars. The war was going well in 1665. Their American colony, New Amsterdam, had been captured and renamed New York. But the French King Louis had just allied with the Dutch. The Great Fire looked like a double whammy. Anyhow, it was apparent to the English that their country was under attack. Dutch and French immigrants, who were thought to have started the fire, were interrogated immediately after fire started. The British took this situation very seriously and created a massacre, killing Dutch, French, Spanish, and Irish immigrants on the streets. The number of dead people had increased in a short time. The demolition of London came hand in hand with the demolition of both people of London and immigrants in London. As time passed, the rumors about the person that started the fire increased. Some were trying to confuse the aggressive crowd that the reason behind the fire was not foreigners. It was said to be God's punishment. However, this argument was not really convincing. A scapegoat was found immediately to blame the devastation of London. He was Robert Hubbard. a French watchmaker. He confessed to the fire and was found guilty by the jury. The written confession consists of his explanation of being a spy of the popes. After his motives, people were furious at him. As Hubbard was being transported to the White Lion prison in Southwark, crowds lined in the street to jeer, spit, and throw stones, manure, and rotting vegetables at him. 27th October 1666 was the date Robert Hubbard was hung. His confession was false, therefore he was unfairly punished. It was some time later, however, that it was realized that he couldn't have started it, as he was not in England at the time. This false confession is said to be the reason for his unstable mental health and the desire to end his pathetic life. However, he was the perfect fit for the English minds regarding starting the fire. While giving his various confessions, he changed his mind and started telling different stories about the fire to convince the jury. The argument of starting the fire outweighed the jury's ideas of him being mad. The real person who was guilty was a baker, Thomas Fariner. He continuously denied the accusations against himself. In the end, the blame left the baker and an innocent immigrant was hung. The fire mainly affected numerous immigrants and the homeless, who are mostly immigrants.
The destructive fire caused more than 13,000 buildings to be left in rubble and ashes, and so a renovation was due. King Charles II desired his capital to be transformed into a modern and even grander city than what it used to be before. But there was more than just one reason why this dream was out of reach for the king for some time. For one, England had been fighting in war during the time of the fire, meaning the country's resources were used for wartime necessities such as firearms, funding for the soldiers, and more. The king did, however, manage to restore one of London's important landmarks as he believed it would please God. This landmark was St. Paul's Cathedral. He asked Christopher Wren, a famous English architect, to redesign. Because of the limited funds available to them at the time, London's infrastructure was kept mostly the same. Despite all this, the council met shortly after the fire to discuss the changes that were to be made to prevent this type of catastrophe taking hold of the capital again. An urgent and important decision was made to immediately rebuild the Newgate prison, which was set ablaze during the fire, putting the general public at risk, also with the possibility of escaped convicts. One of the biggest changes that came out as a possible solution to prevent a fire like this again was to change from wood to bricks in the buildings that were harmed by the fire. By 1680, medieval and Tudor Thames had brick buildings on both sides. Similarly, in both sides of Bishopsgate, there were small houses built with brick in the immediate suburbs from the second half of the 16th century forwards. Some house plans continued to be used after the fire. In the smaller Tudor houses prior to the fire, there would be a plan of only one room with occasionally a separated access entry. This plan was still found in residences after the fire. This horrible disaster that took so many lives, jobs, and homes away from the people who lived in the city managed to contribute to only one thing: ending the bubonic plague. This disease that had already taken at least 75,000 lives away was spread mostly through plague-ridden fleas and rats. After the fire, these disease-spreading creatures were mixed with the ashes of the city, and the plague no longer was a problem for the citizens of London. The fire, which had devastating consequences, had completely changed the modernization phase of the city and the perspective of people towards immigrants. These wild flames seem to have determined the fate of London. However, still today, all damages and deaths stay unspoken. Non-foreigners being wrongly blamed will probably stay as a huge negative effect of the fire. No matter the destruction that took place because of the fire, or the destruction that took place after the fire, there is no doubt that London today has progressed much further than ever could be imagined in those devastating days in the autumn of 1666. it is safe to say that the city has prospered through unimaginable perils and stands even prouder knowing everything it has overcome throughout history.